Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today to learn and talk about bees and beekeeping. I'm Monica Williams with USDA's Agricultural Research Service. I'll be your moderator and we'll be here for about 30 minutes answering your beekeeping questions. So today we'll be talking with bee expert Dr. Jay Evans, who's the research leader at the ARS Bee Research Lab out in Beltsville, Maryland. At the Bee Lab, they focus on improving the health of honeybee colonies and help the beekeeping industry maintain an adequate, healthy supply of bees for the pollination of crops. So let's go ahead and get started and find out where Dr. Evans is. Dr. Evans, thank you for being with us today. Can you tell us where you are right now?
Yeah, thank you, Monica. Good morning. So I am in one of 10 or so apiaries that are run by the researchers here at the Bee Research Laboratory. And each apiary, this one has maybe 15 colonies, and they range from 5 to 20 or so colonies. And we devote each of them to different research projects. And these projects include parasitic mites, which are a big danger for bees, stress on the bees, whether it's chemicals or temperature, queen health, and then a whole range of other interacting factors with disease and nutrition. So our goal is to get management tools for beekeepers and to do it in the laboratory, but also, of course, out here with the colonies.
Great. So, okay, we have quite a few questions coming in already. So let's get some answers. Dr. Evans, what kind of trees or plants do I need to be a beekeeper?
Well, that's a great question, and the locality is very important. So a person might look at the hardiness zone or the area where they live, what grows well, but bees love a diversity of flowers and plants. Here we have trees that provide a lot of nectar and pollen in the spring, and then wildflowers on the ground in the summer, and then maybe toward the end it's goldenrod and a few more straggling sunflowers and asters for the end of the year. But it depends a bit on where you live, but just bear in mind that the bees want something throughout their season, and a diversity of plants is always better. But you can accomplish that in an urban garden or by setting your bees up in a habitat that already naturally has a lot of plants.
Sounds good. Okay, so this is probably a question many of us have. How much honey can a group of bees make?
Okay, well, I will speak for honeybees, and honeybees, as in these boxes here, if you have a box, there are 2 boxes on top of each other with a colony of bees, you have about 40,000 to maybe 60,000 honeybees in there and 1 queen. And those bees are continually foraging, they're bringing in food, of course. They can store in excess of, up to 100 pounds of honey. But a beekeeper might not want to take all that because the bees will need it during the winter. So most beekeepers in this area might get 50 pounds, 70 pounds of honey from a colony, and then leave behind at least 30 pounds of honey for them to consume to get them through the winter.
Cool. So we see that you're standing out in the field there. And can you show us what's behind you? How many boxes do you have there?
Yeah, well, this apiary has been established for decades. I remember it when I started here, and it was here long before. And of course, they're not the same bees every year, but these colonies range from 10 to 20 colonies here. We tend to keep them at this size, 2 boxes in height, and if they get a bit too large, we can split them and set them up in new homes.
That's great. Okay, what about predators to bees? Are there any that I should be aware of?
Well, it depends on where you live. There are beekeepers who live in areas with black bears and even grizzly bears in Alaska and the north. If you are in that sort of habitat, bears are a nuisance predator. They will knock over hives, they'll consume the brood, and mostly they just kind of bust things up. And that's a challenge for beekeepers. They have to set up fences for those. Around here, we don't get visits from bears. We only get, on the mammal side, we get mice, maybe other small mammals, other rodents that cause some nuisance damage. They may want to nest inside there, but they don't really cause much harm to the bees. The real threat to honeybees is, of course, smaller parasites and pathogens. mites, beetles, larvae of wax moths that chew up the hive. And so those are our real threats. They're smaller, more insects and mites, and of course the suite of other diseases that come with them.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. So let's see here. We have one about overwintering. I've heard a lot about overwintering my bees in cold storage. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a really hot topic right now. Beekeepers and researchers are both tackling the question of, can you take these hives that would otherwise be in the elements all winter long and place them into a storage facility, controlling temperature, maybe even the oxygen levels, different elements of that, and help them through winter. Winter is a major loss point for honeybee colonies. In the US, we lose about 30 to 35% of the colonies each winter. And one idea is to reduce that by controlling the temperature and setting up a kind of benign environment where they don't consume as much honey and they're just a bit healthier for the winter time.
Okay, here's a great question from someone who's just getting started. I'm new to beekeeping and I've heard about colony collapse disorder. What is the current state and is it as bad as it was?
Great, yeah, so colony collapse disorder was a phenomenon in the mid-2000s, 2006 to 7. It started with some commercial beekeepers, and it was defined by the entire colony vacating mysteriously. No signs of disease, the queen was there, everything looked pretty good, but the colony died off really quickly. Even then, it wasn't the major cause of colony losses, and it seems to have decreased further since that time. It seems to go in cycles. It remains much of a mystery. We did find some new disease elements, viruses and such. It could be a combination of that and stress. But currently, the main factors that cause colony losses are issues with the queen if she doesn't keep laying eggs, chemical stress, nutrition is a big one. Beekeepers have to leave enough food on their hives or supplement them. And then viruses and bacteria that can really affect the colony from the eggs up to the adults. And those are the factors that kind of slowly wear down a colony and are the biggest factors in colony losses.
Okay, we have a question from a veteran. I'm a veteran and I would like to continue serving the country by helping grow food. Is beekeeping a good option and how do I find out more information?
Wow, that is a great question. And yeah, like serving our forces, working in farming as a service to the country. And so I have heard from veterans who are interested in beekeeping and they have contributed and started up. As with any start into beekeeping as an industry, there is a learning curve. You need to really get involved with maybe a local club, a county club, and learn the trade, both at the hobbyist level and the biology level, but also eventually the business level, moving into it. And it's a challenging, it's a challenging business, but it can be super rewarding in that case. The USDA does have some programs also for training veterans, and so I would look into those and see if they're suitable for your area and of interest to the veteran.
Okay, so this person is asking, how do I get started? What equipment do I need besides the spacesuit?
Well, the spacesuit can be important, although eventually you can wear that down to just a veil and a protection on your face and gloves sometimes. But so what you're looking at is the real material need for beekeeping. They need a structure to live in, and ideally a structure like these where you can access the bees and check on them regularly. There are some alternatives to the standard box beehive that's been around for 100 years, but you need some sort of structure to put them in. So maybe 2 of these boxes to start out with, each of which has 10 frames for the bees to put their eggs, larvae, and also store all of their food as they grow as a colony. You need a tool, it's kind of like a painter's tool to wedge into these colonies and check on them. That's essential, you need that. And ideally a smoker, which will calm down the bees as you work them. And that's about it, those are the essentials. And as you get the bees to start up, you have lots of choices. Maybe a local beekeeper will split off some bees from their colony and give you bees and a queen or the eggs that will lead to a queen. You can buy packages, which are 3 pounds of bees with nothing else, and put them in a box with a queen, and that's another very common way to start up as a beekeeper.
Okay, here's another question. How long can I expect my bees to survive? Do I have to create new hives every year or so?
Well, that's good. Fortunately, not most years. So honeybee colonies over time are replacing their queens over time, and the worker force is turning over, of course. Individual bees die, but the colony can stay in place for years and years. There are issues. You need to watch the queens, and of course, to make sure they're healthy and still laying eggs, and they might have to be replaced directly by the beekeeper if the bees can't do it themselves. And of course, you have to monitor for disease. So these parasitic mites that I'd mentioned are devastating for colonies, and so there has to be some monitoring of that. But if you do all those things, you have a good chance of your hive surviving year after year and being productive for many years.
Okay, so we know there's different types of bees, but is beekeeping different for each type of bee?
Well, so what I've been talking about is beekeeping for honeybees, which is one species, the western honeybee, Apis mellifera, and that's what many people think of with beekeeping. Of course, you have the boxes, you extract honey, and so all of the trade and the ways to keep bees for honeybees are pretty unique to that species. People have grown interested in other bee species that can act as pollinators in your garden, from bumblebees to mason bees, which you can support by putting little hollow tubes up, in a protected area. And those are also valid ways to keep your bee community healthy. They won't produce honey. They're a little bit shorter lived in terms of their activity each year, but they're adding to nature, and they can be a really fun thing to watch as well. But beekeeping in these boxes is restricted to the one species we call the western honeybee.
That's good information. So, okay, this is a two-part question. Is there any money in beekeeping, and can you tell me what kind of profit streams there are?
That's an essential question. We have many successful beekeepers in North America and in the US in particular, some from multiple generations of beekeeping. There is money in beekeeping. It's a very challenging business in many ways, but it's a business that, of course, they've grown to love, and beekeepers appreciate that they're providing something essential to growers and in terms of honey. So the economics are they can be tight, but if you can get a beekeeping business going and serve in different ways. On the smaller scale, you can sell honey locally. You might produce extra bees and sell them to neighbors or even more farther afield. You might choose to breed queens and really select for a trait that's desirable. And that can be done. You can also sell wax. It's not hugely profitable to sell wax, but there are different products in the hive that are important. At the bigger scale, the larger commercial beekeepers all develop a relationship with farmers because they provide pollination that's essential for many crops. So more than half of the honeybee colonies in the US are brought by beekeepers into the almond groves in California early each year. And that event sustains a really valuable crop, the almond, and it also is a partnership. So the beekeepers get paid to bring their colonies there. They spend a few weeks pollinating almonds, and then they might go on to pollinate other crops and be paid for that as well. So you're effectively renting your bees in these crops and then moving them across the country to sustain farming in the US, but also to help support the beekeepers.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Here's another one. Is beekeeping a full-time job, or is it something that I can do part-time?
That's a good thing. So it can be a part-time job and or hobby on the side. You do want to take care of your bees. It can't be something where you plant the bees in your yard and forget about them until the fall. You want to check on them. So it's not a hands-off hobby, but there are certainly different degrees of activity, devotion to your colonies. Many people keep bees in their backyards, and they're able to do that and as a side job or a hobby. Then as they scale up, maybe as people retire, they might get 20 or 40 or 50 colonies, and start to make some money on honey and products from the hive. And that, of course, takes a bit more investment. That might become a part-time or half-time job. And then, of course, there are commercial beekeepers. They're in it permanently 7 days a week, and that's very much a full-time job.
Okay, what does it mean if you find dead bees in my yard or in my house?
Well, if it's just one or two dead bees, certainly in your house, the sad fact is they probably got trapped there trying to get out of a window to go get food, and they starved in the house. So we've all done that. It's often the case where they just get trapped inside the structure and can't get back home. In your garden, bees do die often outside on the ground, and if you're really vigilant, you will see them. But if it's one or two bees and it's occasional, it's not something to worry about. It's just part of their losses. If you see a pile of bees or a pile of bees near a colony, you might have to start exploring whether there's a disease outbreak or an exposure to a chemical or something like that. But for the most part, if you see one or two bees, it's part of their natural cycle. They tend to die outside on the ground.
Okay, this person's asking, why is my honeycomb dark?
Well, so honeycomb starts, the first wax that's laid down for honeycomb is pretty pale, but is used again and again and again, not just for honey, but for raising up new bees. And every time a new bee develops in the honeycomb, she'll leave behind, or he, if they're producing drones, a little layer from her shell as she closes or comes out as an adult. And that layer builds and builds and builds, and eventually turns the cell in the whole frame dark. We do recommend frames being rotated out, every few years, because this can accumulate and other challenges, maybe disease challenges, might accumulate. But there are plenty of frames from bees that are quite dark that have been around for years, and they're perfectly good for the colony.
Good information to know. So this one you may have touched on a bit earlier, but with fall right around the corner and winter not far behind, this person's asking, how do I prepare my hive for fall or winter months?
That's a good question, especially right now. It's not too early to start thinking of the winter. Again, the main thing each of your colonies will need is enough sugar to get through the winter. So they need honey left behind in cells, or sometimes beekeepers actually supplement them with sugars. So weigh your colony, open those boxes, lift them up. They need, in this habitat, at least 30 pounds of sealed, mature honey to get through the winter, and maybe more if it's a big colony. So yeah, make sure there's that balance of food to bees getting through the winter. You do want to treat for disease in most cases, check for mite levels. And again, here in August, it's certainly not too early, and it may be something you should monitor all year round. Check your mite levels and treat if you have to, if you're willing to. There are a variety of soft chemicals, different ways of treating for mites that are well worth it if you want your bees to make it through winter.
Thank you. So this one is along the same line. If there is a severe storm coming, do I need to protect my bees, and how?
Well, yeah, again, watch your habitat and what the other beekeepers are doing. If it's something like a hurricane, you would want to protect the bees from wind, toppling by wind. We have bricks on our hives here, but we have at times put cinder blocks on top of the hives as a way to weigh down the lids and keep them from flying off in a big, big storm. Flooding is a challenge for beekeeping. A lot of our great beekeepers are in the southeast, from Texas all through the southeast, and they have been subject to flooding, whether it's a hurricane or just torrential rain. And so they tend to do, as we've done here, put their bees up on a platform and also try to keep them as much as possible, if it's possible, in a higher terrain so they're not subject to flooding.
Okay, here is an interesting question. How many hives can I have on 1 acre or in one place?
Okay, well, as you can see, we have about a 1/4 acre here and 15 or so hives, But we have a lot of habitat all around us. We have trees, we have fields, so those bees go out and forage. So a bee colony, the foragers in a colony will go 2, maybe 3 miles away collecting their food. So in many senses, it's not how big your plot of land is, it's what your neighborhood is like. Do the bees have good forage? Are they competing? Are they, free to kind of roam and find a lot of food? In that case, you could put, again, 20 colonies on an acre. In most cases, for 1 acre plots, you're surrounded by neighbors. You might have other beehives in the area. So we'd recommend, more like a handful of colonies. But you really have to consider the neighborhood, other activities, and the habitat next door to you.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. How many hives should a beginning beekeeper start with?
Well, that's good. And I am a beginning, several years ago, hobbyist beekeeper at home as well. And I started with 2 hives. And the rationale there, it's a bit more investment than just starting with 1 colony. You have to double your physical investment in the boxes behind me. But if you start with 2 hives and you get them going, tragedy strikes. It usually only strikes 1 of them. So you might lose that hive. And having a backup, there are really good ways worked out by beekeepers where you can actually split that hive, set it up with its neighbor or nearby, and requeen it so you get it started again. So that's one way to kind of cut your losses. If you have 1 hive, both it's tragic because you've lost your whole investment in some ways, but it's also really hard as an individual to restart. You have to go back from scratch, buy some more bees, and get going that way.
So is there an ideal place to start a hive?
There's a lot of discussion on bee colony placement, but also apiary placement. Generally speaking, you'll see, as we have here, beekeepers put their colonies along an edge of trees and open space. Here, we like these colonies because they get a bit of sun that helps them forage, get going during the day, and yet the shade is there in case it gets especially hot. So that protects them also from the wind. So wind can be damaging. So most beekeepers will set up their hives along an edge row of some sort. It could be a fence even, but a place like that. Again, what's most important is that your bees are able to fly freely out, unobstructed, not in a major, say, pedestrian pathway. They can fly out and go find the food that they're seeking without a lot of obstructions.
Okay, so this is our last question, and it's an important one. You kind of touched on it earlier today. How can I find the queen bee?
Yeah, well, the queen is absolutely essential. If you lose the queen and you don't pick up on it, the colony will slowly dwindle down to nothing. A lot of beekeepers like to check directly for their queens, and that involves going through each of the boxes, lifting up each of the 10 frames in each box, and looking front and back. So very carefully going through one by one, and you will find her most times doing that. She can hide, she can be tricky at sometimes, but usually you'll find the queen. The quicker way, and a way that many of us actually use, is simply to do the same thing, looking at those frames, maybe the ones in the middle of the box, and find out if they have eggs. And if there are eggs present, she's in there somewhere, and the colony is safe for some time at least. You know that there's an active queen and she's been laying eggs recently.
Dr. Evans, as always, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time with us today to educate us about bees and beekeeping. And thank you everyone for tuning in and asking such great questions. We have more resources and information on our website about bees and beekeeping, including the latest ARS research on bees. Any questions that we were not able to get to today will be answered, so stay connected with us on social and make sure you check us out at www.ars.usda.gov. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Monica, and thanks for the great question.
Thank you.